Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome to another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the third physiological factor of distance running performance. On other episodes, we've talked about VO2 max and we've talked about running economy. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about lactate threshold. So lactate threshold gets a lot of press these days. You see a lot of it on social media. A lot of people talk about it, but not a lot of people really know what it represents and how you can use it to improve running performance. So first we'll spend some time talking about what lactate threshold is, what does it really mean, and then we'll get into the training. So to start off with, we have to go a little bit back in history to look at what lactate threshold is. And from the time of the classic paper, which I happen to have in my hand, this is the classic paper on lactate threshold and distance running performance. There are some big names on this paper, and this is the paper that everyone in the field of exercise physiology goes back to look at the importance of lactate threshold for distance running performance. And so if you follow the field of exercise physiology, you've seen this paper. Plasma lactate accumulation and distance running performance. This was published in Medicine, Science, and Sports and Exercise in 1979. And the lead author on this paper is Peter Farrell, who is a faculty member at Penn State when I was a student there, an undergraduate there in the early to mid-90s. But if you get your hands on this paper, you'll see that there's a lot of exercise physiology studs on this paper. Peter Farrell, Jack Wilmore, if you're familiar with that name, Ed Coyle at University of Texas at Austin, John Billing, and David Kostel, which is probably the biggest name in the field of exercise physiology. David Kostel was at Ball State University. He was the director of the exercise physiology lab there for many years. He's now since retired. But David Kostel is probably the biggest name in the field of exercise physiology, especially in endurance performance. So this is the classic study on lactate threshold, which they referred to at the time as the onset of plasma lactate accumulation. That's what they measured. They measured lactate concentration in the plasma volume of the blood. So I bring this out to draw your attention to it. If you're interested in the first study that really documented the importance of lactate threshold for distance running performance, then get your hands on this paper by Peter Farrell and his colleagues. This was done at the University of Arizona back in the late 70s. It was published in 1979. And so the way you could think of the lactate threshold, there's a few different ways that you can look at it, a few different perspectives that you can look at it. One of the perspectives is the way that we measure it in the lab, and the reason why it's called lactate threshold. A threshold is the point at which something changes. And so if you open up an old-fashioned exercise physiology textbook, you will see a graph in there that shows how lactate threshold changes. So when you start running pretty slowly, blood lactate is very low. It's about 1 to 2 millimolar of lactate per, the way it's measured is millimolars of lactate, or millimolar lactate per deciliter of blood. So it's a very small amount. So when you go out and run, blood lactate is about 1 to 2 millimolar. And then if you were to pick up the pace and pick up the pace and pick up the pace and get slightly faster and faster and faster, blood lactate goes from a slightly linear increase, and at some point when the speed gets fast enough, it'll change from that slight linear increase to a quick exponential increase. And why that happens, we'll get to that in a minute. But the change in blood lactate from a slight linear increase to a quick exponential increase, that change is referred to as the lactate threshold. So it's the speed or the intensity at which lactate starts to quickly accumulate in the muscles and blood. And why is that important? That's important because even though lactate doesn't cause the problem, you hear a lot of people talk about lactic acid and how that's, causes fatigue and it causes muscle burning, and none of that is true. But what lactate is it's a mirror to what's happening inside the muscle, because there are other metabolites that accumulate at the same time that lactate accumulates, and those other metabolites have been implicated in fatigue. One of them is hydrogen ions. When lactate accumulates, you also get an increased hydrogen ion production. And when you increase hydrogen ions, as we all learned back in high school chemistry class, what happens when you have a lot of hydrogen ions in that solution or in our body? If we have it in the blood or we have it in the muscle, when you increase hydrogen ion production, that lowers the pH. And the pH is indicative of how acidic that solution is. Remember when we were back in high school chemistry class and we took some litmus paper out of a canister of paper. We took a little strip of paper, a little litmus paper. We would dip it in different acids and different bases, and the paper would change color. And then on the back of that canister was a color chart, and you would match up that little strip of paper with a color chart on the back of the canister to measure the pH. And so the lower the pH, then the more acidic. And so when lactate accumulates, one of the other things that happens that's independent of lactate, but it happens concurrently with lactate accumulation, is that we get an increase in hydrogen ions, and that lowers the pH. And so the muscles become slightly more acidic. And that's one major thing that causes fatigue. There are other metabolites that also accumulate at the same time that lactate accumulates that cause fatigue. We have potassium ions, and we also have the two constituents of ATP, adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and phosphate. And ADP and phosphate and potassium ions and hydrogen ions, they all exert their influence differently, but the end result is that we slow down because we decrease muscle force production. That's how scientists define fatigue, a decrease in muscle force production. And so lactate gets a bad rap. Lactate is not a bad thing. We actually need lactate to be produced inside the muscles to stimulate glycolysis, to stimulate the production of ATP through glycolysis. So it's very important, actually. But it gets a bad rap, and it shouldn't get a bad rap. So I'm going to sit here and I'm going to defend lactate. But these other metabolites accumulate at the same time that lactate accumulates, and those other metabolites cause fatigue in some way. They all exert their influence differently. And so the lactate threshold is important because it represents the speed at which we start to develop acidosis. We start to rely more heavily on anaerobic metabolism that doesn't use oxygen to regenerate ATP. And that's why it's such an important physiological marker, because one of the other ways that you can think of the lactate threshold is that at speeds below the threshold, slower than the threshold, it's all aerobic. The anaerobic contribution is negligible. But at speeds above the threshold, you start to introduce a pretty significant anaerobic contribution. And that's one of the things that causes fatigue. When we start to rely on anaerobic metabolism, when we start to recruit more fast-twitch fibers, then fatigue happens a lot more rapidly, and the pace slows down. And so that's why the lactate threshold is such an important physiological variable, because it basically demarcates, it puts a line in the sand from speeds that are all aerobic in nature to speeds that are still largely aerobic, but now include a significant anaerobic contribution. And so when that happens, you slow down. Fatigue becomes much more rapid. Fatigue is imminent. You can't hold a pace above your lactate threshold for very long. Very trained runners can hold it for even a 10K. At the elite level, even at the very good level, people run a 10K faster than the lactate threshold pace. Whereas recreational runners, people who run 45 minutes, 50 minutes for a 10K, they'll be running slower than their threshold pace for a 10K. So we'll get to that in a minute, how these paces correspond to race paces. We'll get to that in a minute. But I first want to talk about, what lactate threshold is, what does it represent, why it's so important. And so the other way you can think of there's a few different perspectives you can take at what the lactate threshold is. And so one perspective that I just mentioned is the speed at which we start to develop acidosis. And that's why I always refer to the lactate threshold as the acidosis threshold. If you read a lot in this field, you might have come across an article I wrote for Track Coach magazine back in 2005. And I coined the term acidosis threshold because it's the speed at which we start to develop acidosis. And I wanted to take the emphasis off of lactate and place it on the thing that causes fatigue. And acidosis is one of the major things that cause fatigue. And so I always refer to it as the acidosis threshold. What is the speed at which we start to develop acidosis? That's really the physiological marker of interest. And so the other way you can look at the threshold is the pace that is the fastest pace that you can run that is still aerobic in nature. So think about if you were to go out for a run, what's the fastest that you can run that it is still aerobic, that you're not dipping into anaerobic metabolism yet? What's the fastest? So it's not a jog, and it's not an all-out fast run either. What's the fastest pace that you can run that it is still purely aerobic? So it's high-end aerobic. There's a rhythm to that pace, to that speed. You have to practice it, and you feel that rhythm. After a while, you'll know what that feels like. It's the fastest sustainable aerobic speed. That may be the best way for runners to think about it. Another way you could think about the threshold is in terms of fuel use and what your muscles are using. Mostly when we talk about running or any kind of exercise, it's an issue of carbohydrate and fat. We use very little protein during exercise. Protein is reserved for other important things that it has to do. So exercise metabolism is really a matter of fat or carbohydrate metabolism. If this is where your threshold lies, then when you're running at some speed below your threshold, you're using some combination of fat and carbohydrate. When you're way down here, it's pretty much all fat, very, very low intensity. And then as you get closer and closer and closer to your threshold, you start to rely less on fat and more on carbohydrate. The reason for that is because we break down carbohydrate and get ATP faster than we would if we used fat. And as the speed increases, the demand for ATP increases. We have to produce ATP faster. So it's better to use carbohydrate to do that than to use fat. Once we cross over the threshold, and now we're running above your threshold, it's only carbohydrate. So the other way you could think of the threshold is the speed at which we go from a combination of using fat and carbohydrate to only carbohydrate. When you're running faster than your threshold pace, you only use carbohydrate. You don't break down fat because it's too slow. Speeds above your threshold are pretty quick speeds. You have to use carbohydrate. So there's no fat that you're using during the exercise when you are running faster than your threshold. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at what the lactate threshold represents. It's the fastest aerobic sustainable speed. It's the speed at which we go from a change of a combination of fat and carbohydrate metabolism to only carbohydrate metabolism. It's the speed at which lactate starts to quickly accumulate in the muscles and blood, and that's where the term has come from, because that's what we do in the lab. We prick people's finger, or we put a catheter in their vein, in their arm, and we can get continuous measurements of lactate, and we look for a change from a slight linear increase to a quick exponential increase. So it's an operational term, because that's how we measure lactate threshold in the lab. We actually measure blood lactate. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. And so now, why is this important? Well, because if you think of what influences different races, there are a lot of different variables, some of which we talked about in other episodes. But when you think about what the lactate threshold represents, it represents the fastest speed that you can run that is still aerobic. So for all distance running races, you can see why the lactate threshold would be important, because the faster that you can run, that the pace is still aerobic, that you're not relying on anaerobic metabolism, then the faster you're going to be able to run for every single race. Everything from 800 meters up to the marathon. And you can also understand that the longer the race, the more important the threshold becomes. Because for really short races, 800 meters, mile, 5K, there's still a pretty significant anaerobic contribution. And so anaerobic metabolism affects those races more than the longer races. But in a race as long as a marathon, isn't that what the marathon really is? It's about how fast that you can run that is still aerobic, because no matter how fast you run the marathon, it's always going to be all aerobic. And so the threshold is important for the marathon and for the half marathon especially, because it represents the fastest pace that you can run that is still aerobic. And so if your threshold pace is only 8 minutes per mile, you run an 8-minute mile pace, then you're going to fatigue at 7:30 pace. It's already going to be slightly anaerobic. And so you're going to fatigue at that pace. Whereas if your threshold pace is 5 minutes per mile, think about how much faster you can run a race and still not have it be anaerobic. And that's why, you look at the best marathoners in the world, they have a very high lactate threshold, and that's why they can sustain such a fast pace for such a long period of time. The world record for the men's marathon is, I think, 4:34 or 4:35 pace. Eliud Kipchoge can run 4:35 pace and still have it be aerobic. That is unbelievable. That's like a machine. But that's why the threshold is so important, because the faster you can make the pace still be aerobic, then the faster pace you would have to run before it becomes anaerobic, and you can delay fatigue. And you can run a whole marathon at a fast pace, relatively speaking, and you'll be okay because it'll still be aerobic. And so that's why the threshold is really important for all distance races, and especially for the longer races. And that's why we come back to this original research study. And so what they did was look at a lot of variables. This is 1979 this was published. So we've known since the late 1970s how important threshold pace is. They looked at a lot of variables, and they did if you're familiar with statistics, they did a multiple regression analysis where you put in a lot of variables and then you look at which exerts the greatest influence, which has the greatest predictive ability on the dependent variable, which was for them distance running performance. They did distance running races, time trials, to look at which variable exerts the greatest influence, which has the greatest predictive ability. And what they found was that the speed at lactate threshold is the greatest single predictor of distance running performance. And there have been many studies that have been done since this original paper came out, and it's true that the lactate, it's the speed at which you're running when you reach your lactate threshold pace. When you reach your lactate threshold is the most important, or one of the most important predictors of distance running performance. So it's huge. The faster you can get your pace and still have it be aerobic, the faster that you're going to be able to run. So now let's talk about, well, what pace is that? And then we'll get into how to train. So the threshold pace is very trainable. It's more trainable than the VO2 max is. It's very responsive to training. And if you look at the best way to tell what your threshold pace is to look at your paces from different races, because you run races at predictable paces based on these physiological factors, threshold being one of those factors. And so if you run a 5K at, say, 7-minute pace, then you can predict what your threshold pace is going to be, because you run these races at predictable paces based on these physiological factors. So let's just take the example, 7-minute pace for a 5K. For recreational runners, 5K pace is going to be a little bit faster than threshold pace. It might be 15 seconds, 20 seconds per mile faster, give or take. It's not exact because it depends on multiple factors, depends on how trained you are, depends on a lot of things. The more trained you are, then the closer the faster you're going to be able to run a 5K relative to your threshold. So say you run a 5K in 15 minutes, that's pretty quick. That's faster than 5-minute pace. You're going to be running significantly faster than your threshold, about 25 to 30 seconds per mile faster than your threshold pace. So threshold pace for a 15-minute 5K runner, a 16-minute 5K runner, threshold pace is going to be about 25 to 30 seconds per mile slower than your 5K race pace. For somebody who is running maybe 23 minutes for a 5K, 24 minutes for a 5K, then threshold pace there'll be less of a difference because it's taken longer to complete the race. So threshold pace may only be about 15 seconds per mile slower than 5K race pace. So the way you can conceptualize this is that if here is your threshold, here's the line in the sand, then if you're a very fast runner and it only takes you 15, 16, 17 minutes to run a 5K, you can deal with that anaerobic metabolism by running a lot faster. So maybe your 5K pace is up here, about 25 to 30 seconds per mile faster. You can handle that difference. But if it's taking you 24 minutes to run a 5K, you're not going to be able to handle so much faster than your 5K because it's taking you longer to complete the race. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. I don't see any nodding. I can't see any nodding through my phone or through the computer, so I'll assume you're nodding. That makes sense. So the slower you run the race, then the more time it takes you to run that race, and the less you're going to be able to run at a much higher, much faster than your threshold pace. So there's going to be less of a difference because it's taking you longer to complete the race. So you can't tolerate the anaerobic metabolism for as long as if you run the race faster. It's taking you less time. So that's the biggest difference when you're looking at, well, how do I figure out the time between my 5K or 10K race pace and my threshold pace, is that you have to look at how long it's taking you to complete the distance. You can't just go by, X. It's not always going to be X seconds difference per mile based on threshold pace. You have to look at how long it takes you to complete the race. So what about 10K race pace? So if you're a very fast runner, if you run a 10K in 35, 36, 37 minutes, you're going to be able to run faster than threshold pace for that 10K. It's going to be about 10 to 15 seconds per mile faster. If you run a 10K in over 45 minutes, then you're not going to be able to run faster than your threshold pace for those 45 minutes. You're going to be much closer. You'll be at or even maybe slightly slower than threshold pace for the time it takes you to run the 10K. So it's variable depending on how fast you run the race. Someone who runs a 10K in 30 minutes, really fast runner, they're going to be maybe 15 to 20 seconds per mile faster than their threshold pace to complete the 10K, because it's only taken them 30 minutes to do it. So it all depends on how fast you run the race, and that will dictate how much of a difference your race pace is compared to your threshold pace. But it's important to know what the threshold pace is so that you can do workouts at threshold pace. Oh, I see a comment. Pete Johnson said, only sprinters matter. Yes, in my youth, I was a sprinter. I remember Pete Johnson. Yes, only sprinters matter. But the public, I wish the public would sprint more. It's exciting. But the public does a lot of distance running, and for some reason, the public thinks the marathon is the holy grail. Personally, I would rather run a mile really fast than a marathon, but the marathon seems to be the holy grail for everybody. So the longer the race, the more important threshold becomes. For sprinters, it doesn't matter, because sprinting is not about, oxygen consumption. It's not about endurance. It's not about aerobic. It's all anaerobic. So sprinting is a completely different animal. Maybe one day on one episode we'll talk about sprinting and how that's different and why it's different and how you train differently to be a sprinter. All right, so let's get back on the road. See, I look at these comments and I get sidetracked. Thanks, Pete, for getting me sidetracked. So let's recap again. So about race pace to threshold pace, then we'll talk about the workouts and how you match it up with the pace. So for 5K, for really good runners, 5K pace will be about, for very, very good runners, about 25 to 30 seconds per mile. For pretty good runners, it'll be a little bit less. It'll be about 20 to 25 seconds per mile faster than threshold pace. For recreational type runners, it'll be even less. You'll be running the 5K at about 15 seconds per mile faster than threshold pace. For 10K, for recreational runners, you're going to be pretty close to your threshold pace of the 10K. If you're running 50 minutes, 55 minutes for a 10K, you're going to be slightly slower when you race that 10K compared to you. So the threshold pace will actually be slightly faster, maybe a few seconds per mile faster. For a very good runner, you'll race that 10K about 15 to 20 seconds per mile faster than threshold pace. So it's predictable. This is all predictable. If I know your threshold pace, I know exactly how fast you're going to run the 5K. I know exactly how fast you're going to run a 10K. And then the same is true for half marathon. If you're a very, very good runner, if you run a half marathon in low 120s, then your half marathon race pace is only going to be slightly slower than your threshold pace will be slightly faster than the half marathon race pace. So once we get into half marathon and marathon, threshold pace is faster than race pace. Whereas for 5K, 10K, threshold pace for most people will be slower than 5K and 10K race pace. But once we start to get to the half marathon and, of course, the marathon, threshold pace is actually faster because you don't run those races above your threshold. You run a half marathon and marathon are run below the threshold. For very good runners, they're slightly below their threshold for a half marathon. In the marathon, everybody, even the best in the world, are below their threshold pace. The very best in the world are just a little bit under their threshold to run the marathon. They're within arm's reach of their threshold the entire marathon. For recreational runners, they're pretty well below their threshold for the entire marathon, because if it takes you 3 hours to run the race, 3.5 hours, 4 hours, the slower you run the race, the more below your threshold you're going to be in a marathon. There's a lot more variability in a marathon because there's a lot more variability in endurance in the marathon. Some people are very good at holding a high fraction of their threshold for a long period of time, and some people are not so good at that. And so if their threshold's here, they may be here to run the marathon. Whereas people who have a lot of good endurance capabilities, where endurance is their strength, then they may only be a little bit below their threshold for the entire marathon. But even the best in the world, still they're averaging below their threshold pace for the entire marathon. So for the half marathon, let's get back to that. For the half marathon, if you're a very good runner, if you're 120 or faster than 120 for a half marathon, then your threshold pace may only be about 5 seconds per mile faster than the half marathon pace. Whereas if you're a more recreational runner, if you're 130, 145, somewhere in that range for a half marathon, then your threshold pace is going to be considerably faster than your half marathon race pace. Your half marathon race pace may be 20 seconds, 25 seconds per mile faster than slower than your threshold pace. Threshold pace will be maybe 20, 25 seconds per mile faster than the half marathon race pace. So the reason I'm not giving you very specific on, because it's hard. You have to know the runner. You have to know yourself, because there is a lot of variability in this. You're talking about the lactate threshold, which you take somebody off the street, their lactate threshold is going to be pretty low. It's going to happen at a pretty slow speed. But then as you train, it becomes very responsive to training, and it moves up higher and higher, closer to your VO2 max. And so that's the goal of training. If here is your VO2 max, you want your threshold to be at as high of a fraction of that VO2 max as possible. But there's a lot of variability in there. A recreational runner, their threshold may occur at only 75 to 80% of their VO2 max, whereas a really highly trained runner, their threshold pace will correspond to 85 to 90% of their VO2 max. And so there's a lot of variability in where the threshold lies in relation to your VO2 max and in relation to race pace. There's a lot of variability in that. But once you know what your correct threshold pace is, then you can train it. All right, so let's get into the training. So now we know the pace, we know what it means, we know why it's important, and we know what the pace is. Now let's get into the training of it. So the standard way to train threshold is to run at threshold pace. So it's like what runners call a tempo run, because it's an up tempo. So it's not all out, but it's not a slow jog either. You run at your threshold pace. So a standard threshold run may be you do your warm-up, maybe a mile or two warm-up, and then you do maybe 20, 25 minutes at threshold pace, and then you do your cool down. That's just the standard general tempo run. But there's a lot of other ways you can do it. And so let me backtrack a little bit and get into, well, why do you do it that way? Just like with any physiological factor, if the goal is to improve that factor, is to raise the ceiling, so to speak, then you want to run right up against that ceiling. So here's your threshold. The way to train the lactate threshold is to repeatedly, over time, run right up against that threshold. If you constantly run right up against the ceiling of that threshold, you make specific physiological adaptations to raise that threshold to a faster speed. And then that's how your speed increases. And now over time, you'll be able to run faster and still have it be aerobic. And so that's the goal of training, is to keep pushing that threshold up and up and up to faster and faster speeds, so that you can maintain a faster speed before you fatigue. Because the faster your threshold is, the faster you can run before it starts to become anaerobic. And the faster that you can run before it starts to become anaerobic has obvious implications for every race you run. Every race you run is going to be faster, especially the longer races, because now you can run at a faster pace before you start to fatigue. And that's the goal of training with this, is to run as fast as possible and still have it be aerobic. So the standard threshold run, maybe about 20 minutes. At first, maybe if you've never done this kind of training before, maybe start with just 1 or 2 miles. It doesn't even have to be 20 minutes. Anything is better than nothing. So maybe just start with 10 minutes the very first time you've ever done this. And then over time, you try to extend how many minutes I run at threshold pace. And you keep trying to raise that ceiling. So you run right up against that ceiling. The other way you can do it is break it up into an interval format. So the whole purpose of running intervals is because you take a set amount of work and you break up that set amount of work into periods of work and rest and work and rest and work and rest. And by doing that, you can accomplish a more total amount of work at a given intensity. So if you break it up as an interval workout, then you may be able to accomplish more than 20 minutes in that. Whereas if you did it continuously, maybe 20 minutes is as much as you can handle, and then you're gassed out. And so if you break it up into an interval workout, maybe you can handle 25 or 30 minutes in that workout by breaking it up. And so, for example, you can do it in terms of time. You can do maybe 5-minute sections and do maybe 5 times 5 minutes, 6 times 5 minutes, and take a minute break in between. If you can't repeat the same pace for the next 5-minute rep, then that tells you, if you can't repeat it after just 1 minute rest, then that tells you went too fast, because you should have been able to do this continuously without taking any breaks. And so when you break it up into an interval format, don't run any faster than you would if you did it continuously. The whole purpose of doing it as an interval workout is simply that you can accomplish more total volume, more work at that pace. And so you want to still run at the same pace, but the goal is to accomplish more total minutes, more total time at that pace. And so maybe you do 5 times 5 minutes or 6 times 5 minutes with a 1 minute break in between. Or you can do it in terms of distance, like if you're on a track or if you're on a marked bike path, maybe you can break it up into mile reps. Or if you're international, maybe break it up into 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers is a mile and a quarter. So maybe break it up into 2K reps or even 1K reps or 1 mile reps, and if you think in terms of miles. And then just take about a minute, no more than 2 minutes rest, because you don't want to take a lot of rest. It's still aerobic, so you want to take very short recovery. So no more than 2 minutes, preferably 1 minute. And so you can it's a very nice workout to do that on the track. You can do, 3 times 1 mile, 4 times 1 mile, 5 times 1 mile at threshold pace with a very short passive recovery in between. And so that's the other way you can do the workout. And there are some other ways that you can do the workout. If you're training for longer races, then you can keep lengthening how long you try to hold near your threshold pace. So if you're going for a very long run, if you're going for a long tempo run, maybe 6 miles, 7 miles, 8 mile tempo run, well, that would be too long to do for most people at threshold pace. And so you can go slightly slower than threshold pace to accommodate the longer distance. So you can attack the threshold a few different ways. You can do either the intervals or a short tempo run right up at threshold pace, or you can do a longer run to prepare for the half marathon and marathon. You can go a longer run at slightly slower, so maybe 10, 15, no more than 20 seconds per mile slower than threshold pace to accommodate the longer race. And that gets you ready for these longer races like half marathon, marathon. I'm coaching somebody right now who lives in Denver, a very good runner, and that's what we're doing with her right now. She's preparing for a half marathon, and we're going, like even today, she did 8 miles at 15 seconds a mile slower than her threshold pace. She's doing this at altitude, so that makes it even more challenging. So we just go 15 seconds a mile slower, so only a little bit slower than threshold pace, but she holds that for, today she did 8 miles at 52 minutes. She's running at altitude, she's running 6:30 pace, because her threshold pace at altitude would be 6:15. At sea level, it would be like 5:55 to 6 minutes. And her threshold pace at altitude, where she is at 5,000, 5,500 feet, is 6:15 pace. So we do these long tempo runs at 6:30 pace, which is 15 seconds per mile slower than her threshold pace. And then if you're training for a marathon, you can get into some really complex training, which is fun but very demanding, where you can get into these medium long runs, maybe 14, 15, 16, 17 mile long runs, where you do a portion of it at threshold pace. And you can get creative. You can weave the threshold throughout. So maybe you do 5 miles easy plus 2 miles at threshold, plus another 5 miles easy, plus another 2 miles at threshold. Or you can backload it and maybe do 10 miles easy plus 4 miles at threshold to do a 14-mile run. That's hard to do, to try to pick up the pace, the threshold pace at the end, the last 4 miles of a 14-mile run. That's difficult. It's very demanding. But that's very good training for a marathon. It really prepares you for the really long races. So I wouldn't use that kind of a workout for somebody unless they're training for long races. If you're training for a 5K, 10K, there's really no reason to do that kind of long run with the threshold. I would stick with the threshold intervals and the tempo run. But if you're training for half marathon and marathon, you got to get used to that dead-legged feeling where you've used a lot of carbohydrate in your muscles throughout the long race, and then you're still trying to pick up the pace toward the end. And so those kinds of workouts where you combine, where maybe you don't go as long as a very long run. Maybe you don't go 20 or 22 miles. Maybe you go 14, 15, 16, but you do a portion of it at threshold pace. That does a few different things. It gets your legs used to picking up the pace after running for so long. And also, because you're picking up the pace, you're using carbohydrate, you're using muscle glycogen at a faster rate, so you get glycogen depleted earlier in the run because you're picking up the pace. Remember what I said about earlier, that when the faster the pace, as you approach your threshold, you start to rely more on carbohydrate and less on fat. And then when you cross over the threshold, you rely just on carbohydrate. So there's also a fuel use adaptation to doing those kinds of workouts where you mix the easy running with threshold running, and you start to use muscle carbohydrate at a faster rate, and you get your muscles used to running low on carbohydrate, which is very important for those long races, like definitely the marathon and also for the half marathon for a lot of people. And so there's the training menu. There's the menu of different kinds of workouts. You have the standard run at threshold pace, tempo run at threshold pace. Then you have threshold intervals, where you break up the work into smaller segments. You still run the same pace. Don't get tempted to run faster because the work periods are smaller. Run at the same pace. To cause fatigue, do more volume at the right pace. Do more volume at threshold pace rather than run faster. Don't increase the pace of the threshold workouts until your races have shown that your fitness level is higher. When you start to run the races at a faster pace and you start to see that you're getting faster, then you change the pace of the workouts. The races, we talked about this on another episode, the races dictate the training speeds, not the other way around. If this is where your threshold is, then you want to run at your threshold pace. Don't try to force the threshold pace to get faster. If you run up here, that's no longer a stimulus to train this. Run right up against threshold pace. And you can do it for, like I said, for the longer races, you can attack it from the underside. Run longer at slightly slower than threshold pace. And you'll still get very fatigued because you're extending this out for as long as you possibly can. And that's the goal when you're trying to train for half marathon or marathon. Okay, so that gets into a lot. I know that was a lot for this. I mean, we have a few more, we have up to 20 minutes left to talk about this. So I'll try to get to some questions. But I just wanted to make sure you have a firm handle on what the threshold is, what it describes, what is happening. And so if we go back to that, let's bring this full circle and get back to that. So the reason why lactate accumulates, why we go from a slight linear increase to a quick exponential increase, is because we always have this balance between lactate production in the muscle that happens because we're relying more on carbohydrate metabolism and glycolysis as an energy system. The final end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. And that pyruvate has two fates. It will either get oxidized inside the mitochondria, go the aerobic way, the aerobic channel, or it will get converted into lactate, the anaerobic channel. And we want to increase the speed at which that anaerobic channel happens to produce lactate. So the very final step of glycolysis is that conversion under anaerobic conditions. The lactate will be chemically reduced into lactate. And like I said before, lactate's not such a bad thing. We actually need the lactate to be produced, but there are other things that happen at the same time that lactate accumulates that cause fatigue. And so we always have this balance between production of lactate and removal of lactate. It's like you can think of a seesaw, or the better analogy is a bucket of water. I always use this analogy a lot. Think of a bucket outside in the rain. And when we have a little bit of rainfall, the rain enters the bucket. And say we have a hole in the bucket. So when we have a little bit of rainfall, the rain enters inside the bucket, but it drains out through the hole. Now say the rainfall gets larger and larger. We get a heavier and heavier and heavier rainfall, and so we have more rain dumping in the bucket. The rainwater will still leave through the hole in the side of the bucket, but at some point, at some level of rainfall, at some speed, the rainfall is going to be too overwhelming, and to drain the water through the hole, and the level of the water in the bucket is going to start to rise, and it's going to overflow. And so that's how you can think of the lactate threshold, is that we have this constant production of lactate, but at some speed, the production of lactate is going to exceed the ability to remove that lactate and take it to the other places where lactate is used. It's used by the liver, it's used by the heart for energy, and it's used by the liver to make new glucose through gluconeogenesis, that fancy term name that a lot of people get confused by. But the liver will actually take the lactate to make new glucose, which is absolutely fascinating. We'll talk about that on another show. But so you can think of the lactate threshold is this bucket with the rainfall. And so the way to improve the lactate threshold, the way to increase the amount of rain, the water leaving the bucket, is to do what? To increase the size of the hole in the bucket so that we get more removal of the water. So it's the same concept inside of our body. That the way we increase the lactate threshold to a faster speed is by improving the ability to remove lactate from the muscles. And that's one of the great adaptations that we make when we train. And so the reason why lactate accumulates quickly and exponentially is because we produce more lactate than we can remove. And so the balance of lactate removal and production, the production starts to exceed the removal. The removal lags behind the production. And so the goal of training is to enhance the removal of lactate so we can get back to a balance at a faster speed. And so that's what's happening inside the muscle. And it turns out that unlike the VO2 max, we're going to compare this to VO2 max, unlike the VO2 max, which is mostly limited by your heart's ability to send blood and oxygen to the muscles, interestingly, the most limiting factor of lactate threshold is not cardiovascular. It's not oxygen and blood flow to the muscle. It's not oxygen delivery to the muscle. It's oxygen use by the muscle. It's the peripheral muscular adaptations. And so we have to train those things. We have to add more mitochondria. We have to build a greater capillary network surrounding our muscle fibers, because it's the muscular peripheral adaptations that more greatly influence the lactate threshold than the cardiovascular adaptation. So I want to be clear about that even though these two variables affect distance running performance, they're affected by different things. And so the lactate threshold is more limited by what's going on inside the muscle. So if you increase the amount of mitochondria you have, if you really beef that up and get a lot of mitochondria inside your muscles, the reason why that works is because it goes back to what I just said 2 minutes ago, that pyruvate from glycolysis has two fates. It has oxidation inside the muscle mitochondria, or it has reduction to lactate. If we want to channel and if we want to shuttle that pyruvate into the mitochondria for oxidation, then the more mitochondria we have, the more aerobic factories we have, the better we're going to be able to do that. The more pyruvate from glycolysis we're going to be able to shuttle into aerobic metabolism and delay anaerobic metabolism. And that's the goal, is to delay the onset of anaerobic metabolism. No anaerobic metabolism, I don't want you here right now. That's what we want, because then we can run at a faster aerobic speed, and all of our races are going to get faster. And so that's why the peripheral adaptations are so important. The more mitochondria you can make inside your muscles, then the more it can handle pyruvate coming from glycolysis. And it will delay anaerobic metabolism, will delay the conversion of pyruvate into lactate. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? I hope it makes sense. I can't get your feedback on here because I see you. But to tell me in the comments that yes, that makes sense. And so that's why we have to make as much mitochondria as possible, and all the aerobic enzymes that are inside those mitochondria, we have to enhance that as much as possible. Because if we enhance that, then we enhance aerobic metabolism. And then we can handle a faster pace and still have it be aerobic. And that's probably the best way I can explain why this is so important. Because it's all about improving the speed that you can run at which it will still be aerobic. And then all your races will get faster. So let me see if some questions. I know that I'm talking a lot, so let's see if we can get to some questions here. See, on Instagram you have to scroll a lot. Pete says, I'm going to start intervals at the time. Okay, very good, Pete. All right, do that workout. When you start introducing the threshold workouts, the best way to introduce is probably an interval format, because it is physically and psychologically easier to break it up in an interval format. But don't get crazy with it. Don't think that just because I'm running only a mile at a time or a few minutes at a time that I can go fast. Run at threshold pace and get fatigued by running more and more and more volume. If it takes 5 times 1 mile to fatigue you, then run 5. If it takes 7, then it takes 7. But run more. If it only takes 2, then do 2. Whatever it takes. You just find where your starting point is and progress from there. And then over the weeks and months of training, you add more volume, or even you add a second workout per week. Start with 1 workout per week, and then over time, as you progress, add a second workout per week. And so you're adding volume 2 ways. You're adding volume by lengthening each workout, by adding more volume to the specific workout, more distance or more time to that workout. And then you're adding volume by doing more workouts per week or more workouts per month. And so add more volume at the correct pace rather than run faster than the correct pace. Okay, what else we got here? All right, feel free to ask any questions. A lot of people in here, but people aren't asking questions. Feel free to ask any questions. If you're just joining us, welcome to Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Join us every Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific. I'm getting my times crossed. I'm on the West Coast, so it's Pacific time at noon and East Coast time, Eastern time at 3 p.m. Every week on Facebook. We're on 2 channels here. We're on Facebook Live. If you're joining us on Facebook, hi. If you're joining us on Instagram, hi. I got 2 cameras set up, phone and computer. And welcome to Run Talk with Dr. Jason Karp. Let's see. Feel free to ask any questions about threshold. It's something that really a lot of people are confused about because a lot of runners want to push the pace, and there's a rhythm to the threshold. You really have to lock into what that rhythm is, and then over time, you increase how much volume you do at that pace. And then the other thing we can talk about is strengths and weaknesses. If you know that you have good aerobic strength, if you know that the longer the race, the better you get, that you're very good at long endurance, then load up on the threshold work. You're going to be very responsive to that work. If you're more like me and you're better at speed than you are endurance, then you don't have to do as much. You got to cater to your strengths. You have to skew the training to what you're best at, what you're genetically predisposed for. But the threshold training, especially if you are aerobically inclined, if you're very good at aerobic work, then load up on the threshold work because that's what you're going to be very responsive to and adapt to. Okay, we got a lot of people in here. Michael Sommer, all the way from Switzerland. He's in here. Hello, Michael. So, I think I've covered it all. I've covered a lot in the last, 45 minutes. So, if there's no questions, then, feel free to ask questions. I'll answer questions in the comments. But this may be a good place to end the episode. So every episode, I end with, some kind of thought. And so on today's episode, my thought is going to be to, use running as a way to challenge yourself. I mean, it's pretty cool that running is a very easy activity in which to challenge yourself, because on any given run, you can just decide to pick up the pace and to see where that increased pace takes you. It's very easy to run slow all the time. And a lot of runners get scared of picking up the pace and running faster, especially a lot of beginner runners. And so, use your runs to challenge yourself a little bit and see what happens. Sometimes the purpose of a run could simply be for the psychological reasons of pushing the pace and seeing what that does for you psychologically as well as physically. And so play with paces, use the threshold pace, use other paces, play with different paces in training, and use running to challenge yourself. And that's part of the beauty of running, that on any given day, on any given run, you can just decide, hey, I'm going to pick up the pace now and see what happens. I mean, you're not going to blow up, you're not going to die, just see what happens. And then over time, you get used to picking up the pace, and then eventually you have this whole range of paces that you can run at, from very slow to very fast, and you become this complete runner where you have, just like on a bicycle, it has different gears. You can change the gears. How cool would that be, to be able to change gears at different times in a run? And so use your running to change gears and challenge yourself. That's it for today's show. Thank you very much for joining us. Come back next Monday, where we'll have another episode of Run Talk with Dr. Jason Karp. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good week, everyone. Bye for now.